today our section is focused on the portrait head. And we'll spend a good deal of time with that, but obviously we've got some challenges considering we have a pandemic going on and we have half of our faces covered. So it'll be a little different than how I typically cover it. We will be working a lot with photography as a means to do that, but I'll walk you through all of that. Either which way, we need to really focus on the anatomy of the head to start. And on your paper, I need you to kind of draw a little skull. Just a real quick circle with some teeth, some orbits of the eyes, etc. And I'm going to walk through this because I can't have like 20 minutes of this with nothing going on. There are some major bones that are a part of superficial anatomy that are important. And when I say superficial anatomy, I mean the things that you will encounter and be able to see while you're working with a model or yourself. Interior anatomy is very, very different than superficial anatomy. So we're not going to go in depth. It's not a gross anatomy exploration, but what it is primarily the things that you will encounter. And on a skull, the very front bone is simple. It's called the frontal bone. It is your forehead. But in the middle of that bone, right between your eyes, that's called the glabella. And what men have that women do not have is a brow ridge. You have a development of not only the bone as a process, and if you've never heard that term, a process means it sticks out. But you also have an excessive, not excessive, more of a muscular development on top of that bone than women do. It develops in puberty, which will give you a likeness and something to really anticipate while you draw. You're also going to have the eyebrow, which is called the superciliary arch. And the superciliary arch basically is the housing of the orbit of the eye. And the orbit of the eye, depending on how wide, depending on how long, depending on how deep, will determine various things about how your eye lays on your face, how large they are, how large they appear. If you have hooded lids, if you do not have hooded lids. Additionally, you will have where near your tear ducts are, but on your nose, that's called the lacrimal bone. And then your cheekbone is very important. That's called the zygomatic bone. I'd like you to kind of touch that right now. Underneath your eye, go from your nose all the way over to the side of your eye, and then find that near your ear. That bone is really, really important in terms of structure and in terms of likeness. How high it is depends on how you age. If it breaks, like say a boxer or in a UFC match, someone breaks the zygomatic bone, your eye will droop. It will fall into the cavern of the cheek and the sinuses. So it'll appear lopsided when it heals. It is a really important facet of likeness. Additionally, your nose is called the nasal bone, which is fairly simple. Beyond that, you've got a mandible. And your mandible is, the lower portion of your jaw. And you have some muscles on the lower portion of your jaw that I'd like you to flex right now and touch. Grit your teeth. Chomp them together. You will feel with your hands a projection of the mandible. Men have a larger mandible, but they also have a larger musculature there. And on the side of the face, side of the head, known as the parietal side of the skull, you will also have a larger muscle there. If you see a gorilla, gorillas spend their time chewing, right? They eat leaves, various foliage. Now, they have a very, very small brain casing, and it is carved inward, kind of like this. Turn around, kind of like that. So like instead of a round brain casing, it's carved away because of the development of the muscles on the side of the head, because of all of that chewing. So men will have much more developed area than women will on that, okay? All right, above the mandible, so your upper lip is called the maxilla, and those, of course, house the teeth. The only thing that is able to move is the mandible in the skull, nothing else, and it's just hinged, okay? So those are the important facets. Those are the things you want to remember. I'll call the skull the cranium as well. I'll also call the zygomatic bone the zygoma, okay? All right. When you draw the head, and I'll walk you through this in the demo, you start with an egg, and you slice that egg in half vertically, all right? And an egg that would be against gravity, in that the small part, the pointy part of the egg, is at the bottom, obviously where the chin is. Now, when I break the head down, there's actually a very clear distinction of thirds in a head. And the tendencies for students to rely on certain things are always a given. Students will always make the features way too big compared to the actual head itself, okay? Students will draw the hair within the egg rather than on top of the egg. Students will rely on their conventional notion of eyes, like manga eyes, and they will make them huge. So if what you're looking for is visual acuity, perceptual accuracy, and essentially a likeness, you want to remember those things and try to avoid them. And I'll walk you through those rules in a sec. When we get to the mouth, there's a couple of things you want to know. Upper lip and lower lip are far too simple. We have some anatomy to go through. The edge of the mouth, where the flesh turns to the red, because the mouth essentially is your body turning inside out, right? Your lips are where your body is turning inside out. It's an orifice. It's another orifice. Your body has like 7 of them, I think. That's called the vermilion. So that red line there that you'll see on that pale complected model there, that's what that is. The little divot at the top of the upper lip, where we go shh, 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 with our fingers, is called the philtrum. And that's a divot to always anticipate. That philtrum is different on everyone. Some might have a cupid's bow. Does anybody know what a cupid's bow is? Yeah. It just looks like a very elegant arch on the top of a lip. I don't have a cupid's bow. I have a very sharp, angular, carved out philtrum. So these are things to look for. When we go to the proportions of the head, as I said, you want to think about it in terms of thirds. And pretty much along the halfway point, you will see the eyes, okay? And I want you to notice everything that lines up. The top of the eyes, or at least the eyebrow, generally lines up with the ears. The bottom of the nose lines up with the bottom of the ear. Now, granted, this is based on the ideal man. None of us in here are ideal. We're unique snowflakes unto ourselves. The notion here is this is a foundation to build upon and to alter. So what we're doing is we're editing the ideal man in order to create a likeness. So I'm going to show you a bunch of artists, and you're going to write down the ones that you like, because your first assignment is going to be a self-portrait. And you will be doing, in the spirit of Halloween, a theatrical self-portrait, okay? So we're going to kind of focus on various ways that that can be expressed. Here we have Rembrandt. He did self-portraits all throughout his life. He was known as the master of light because he utilized chiaroscuro, light, dark. His light seems to be emerging from the darkness, and that's what makes his images so theatrical. They look as though they are created on a stage. He will contort his face. He will play with props, all of those things. He doesn't disguise his likeness or his identity, but what they are doing is indeed acting. Here we have Samuel Palmer, and this is a very sort of distinguished upper-class self-portrait using heightened drawing as a means to do it on very dark-toned paper. So he's playing with the sort of notion that he is also an aristocrat. Remember, artists have always been sort of aligned with lay people, bricklayers, right? Until the Renaissance, that really changed. Raphael, and what's beautiful about Raphael is he's using sort of expression that is in an embedded narrative. So he might be pulling from a mythology, but more often than not, he's pulling from biblical scripture. So, oh, please don't tell me, the chosen people have defied God's orders again, right? That's what we see this sort of old man doing. Adolf Menzel is using light as a means to provide a kind of theatricality. He's also using the proppings of a dress, right? Look at those hatch marks. Isn't that great? Love it. Anthony van Dyck was actually the student of Peter Paul Rubens. And obviously they're theatrical because they're very much about dignity, wealth, prestige, cachet. Ilya Repin was a Soviet, a Russian, who actually is the sort of foundation for Russian realism, and still to this day, there are all these Ilya Repin academies throughout, what do we call it now, the Soviet Union? I'm old, I'm showing my years, yes?
Do you spell Ilya I-L-Y-A?
I-L-Y-A, that's correct. And it's Ilya Repin. He's an amazing painter, but his drawings obviously are the foundation of that, and they're fantastic. And you see a little bit of ink wash in this one and heightened with chalk. Dick Kett, all of them are very strangely coy. They're subtle, but they are, I would consider them theatrical, the slight twist of his eyebrow here. Gustav Klimt, his are very sort of romantic in this sort of conventional sense where they're idealized, they're very ethereal, everyone appears as if they're using drugs, right? Very romantic, sort of on another plane of existence. Leon Bakst, here's a sort of plain girl, right? Very fair young woman. And Kata Colwitz. Kata Colwitz was, I believe I've talked about her before. She fled Germany during World War II. She was a Jew. And she did self-portraits throughout her entire life. The foundation of her work is drawing because she was primarily a printmaker, a graphic artist. That's why we say graphic arts, because it originated as print. So we have two self-portraits that she's done here at very different times in her life, as an elderly woman and as a young woman. She's just set up mirrors to be able to see herself in full profile. And I've done this. It just takes two mirrors and some clever situating. Nathan Ford, a sort of very dour, almost angry expression. Daniel Blimes. I'm not familiar with his work at all, but I really like how he's activating the surface with lines and value. Stephen Azale is exclusively a figure painter. He does very, very tightly rendered both paintings and drawings. His drawings are all executed almost in pencil, and they're very, very small. They're very, very difficult to distinguish sometimes if they're photographs or not. I've seen them in person, and they're like the size of printer paper. They're tiny. And he does them in over several hours of observing with the model. So these are done from direct observation. Oh, and they're all characters, right? She's a sort of burlesque performer. He did a whole series of people who were tattooed and punks, and right, people who are really goth, like super, super goth in the 2000s. He did those. Adolf Menzel again. Sorry, I repeated myself. Did I?
Yes.
Okay. Ian Ingram does mostly self-portraits, almost exclusively, and these are huge. These are like 5, 6, 7 foot drawings, all done in charcoal and various pastels. And he really does play with identity, and he uses light, and he uses these sort of abstract mechanisms in order to sort of play with the projection of his ethos, his perceived persona. Nikolai Blocken, also a Soviet academic realist. He did lots and lots of like history paintings of like, oh, you know, it's a revolt in St. Petersburg, right? Michael Grimaldi, I would call this theatrical because of the light, not necessarily the expression. So I want you to notice how form can dictate whether or not something is dramatic versus something artificial, like I'm going to throw a hat on and make a funny face. Does that make sense? Form versus some kind of contrivance. Jeffrey Hine, I think it's theatrical because he's sort of emerging from the shadows. He's shirtless, it's confrontational, a number of things. Jacques Brady, I just liked what he was doing with the heightened aspect here, the heavily worked area and then the very, very minimalist worked area. I love how the hair just sort of gets lost, right? That's really smart. Colin Davidson, he's playing a lot with line, heavy use of line and hatch marks. Colleen Berry, more of a traditional academic. This is done from direct observation, clearly, from a model, paid probably. Oh, David Casson. David Casson does very dramatic portraits. Oftentimes the identity is the important part. So he did a whole series of his relatives who lived through the Holocaust. And that grew into a further development of the series where he exclusively devoted all of his paintings for several years to survivors of the Holocaust. And so there's a certain sort of dignity and story and weight and gravity to the life that these people have lived and, almost lost. Bill Murphy, love the sort of drama in what he's doing with mark making and this sort of like weird ethereal, like lost expression he has, the mouth open, the gasping for breath. And then we have a real like traditional sense of drama here where light is actually used like the limelight in a 19th century stage. And we call it limelight because they actually used to use lime as a chemical to burn the lights before electricity. And so people were lit from underneath just like this, and we call it limelight because it turned them green. It didn't literally turn them green, it made them look green in the light. So that's essentially what he's playing with here, the underlighting and the darkness and richness of shadow. Ginny Grayson, I've showed you her before. She uses sort of an amalgamation or an excess of lines in order to build values and structures. She does a series of animals that I really like. Animals can be really trite and really kind of cliche, but she does them very, very smartly. I think they're very sophisticated and interesting. All right, gaining popularity the last couple years, Melissa Cook. She does primarily drawings of herself. And they're drawings of herself done in a sort of excruciating pain. Some of them are strangely abstracted. Some of them are wrapped in plastic, right, as if she's trying to breathe through a plastic bag and it's suffocating. So they're obviously, on the surface, very dramatic, right? And she's using herself because that's what she's exploring, the notion of her identity itself feeling suffocated. How does she do what? This? She's a photorealist. You see on the left-hand side of her studio, she has a lot of really good shots. And we're going to talk about that because I'm a photorealist. And I think it's really, really important to work from good sources. I see a lot of students who want to make photorealist work, but they don't work from prints. They work from tiny little phones. And they're completely clueless as to how to achieve a surface like this when it basically is an attention to a very, very good print. And being able to manipulate the material at a certain scale that will allow you to do that. So photorealists tend to work fairly large for that reason. What you don't know, if you've never seen a photorealist work in person, is that when you see one in person, especially if it's large, it doesn't look like a photo. It looks warped in person. Now, what we're looking at here is a duplication, right? It's a photo of the space. It's flat. But when you see these things in person and you come upon them, you recognize that what they are and what a photograph is a distortion. It is a monocular form of vision. It is lens-based versus the way you see, which through the synapse and gray matter of your brain, you're able to sort of round things out in the way that the camera cannot. Does that make sense? So that's why she's got all those great photos across the wall there. Stanley Spencer sort of played with sort of frumpiness or lackadaisical expression of, detachment. He did self-portraits throughout his entire life as well, and portraits of his lover, and they're very unflattering. Every single one of them is unflattering, which is what I find very interesting and theatrical about his work. And it's stylistic, but also I think it was intentional as well. Michael Reedy, I've talked about him a little bit before. Obviously, the unconventionality of the subject here being pregnant and nude is essentially the dramatic part, right? But he's also using the interior and the background as a means to suggest other things. We see lilies. Those are lilies. And what? Those are, I kind of see eyeballs too. They're eyeballs coming out of the lilies, aren't they? Now, what is a lily an emblem for? A lily is an emblem for the Mother Virgin, right? So he's making alignments that are seen in her history, and then he's making these sort of weird suggestions as they sort of morph into something else. And the eyeballs reiterate the breasts, and the lilies themselves reiterate the sort of the emblem from art history. Nicholas Uribe, he does drawings and paintings. He's primarily trained as an illustrator, but why I think they're dramatic is oftentimes a sort of unconventional pose. Hey, I need you to turn around so I can draw a portrait of you, right? Mary Borgman, I was actually introduced to this woman's work way back when I was your age in Chicago at a gallery, and they were all done on what's called mylar. And mylar is a kind of plastic paper, and so they're charcoal drawings that are done on something that is not absorbent. So it sort of slides around a lot like paint, right? And they're very, very large, and they're all very sort of standard portraits of sort of strong subject matter, very confrontational. Whitfield Lavelle is only using imagery from the 19th century slave era. He's pulling from history. He is an African-American artist who will choose various things that are aged. Much of the actual surfaces that he draws on with charcoal are taken from like old slave houses or old slave cabins, the floorboards, etc. And he will transform them using the act of drawing as a means to make a meditation on his lineage and on the lives of these people. He draws them in a dignified way. Some of them are from like the 50s. This is obviously from the 50s regarding the, like the quality. And he'll pair them with various objects as a means to sort of make parallels to, emblems that we know, that we understand. This is barbed wire. It also looks like a crown of thorns, right? So he's obviously making a commentary about slavery in America. Yanni Floros, I don't know a lot about this artist either, but hey, I want to do a portrait of you, turn around. So that's a different kind of confrontation, right? It's a sort of negation of the identity of the subject, right? It becomes a portrait of her hair. It becomes a portrait of titillation, and in a very strange way, I would say the exotification of her, of the texture of her hair. I'm looking at you on the bus. You are not, you aren't aware of me, right? I'm thinking about you in this way. So what happens when we take the model and we do something different with them? It creates a narrative. Susan Hoffman only does self-portraits, and these are also huge drawings. They're also very confrontational. And some of them are half nude, some of them are nude, and she's an aging woman, so it's very unconventional in terms of what we see in the media. They're done from photography, typically. My two mentors actually went to grad school with her, and they have great stories about how she would come out of the studio at the end of the day covered in charcoal dust. And she wore a mask when she did it, and so everywhere she was covered in charcoal except for the mask part. And she worked with a mechanical eraser, and so all you heard for 10 hours a day in her studio was and she would just blow through these erasers. So they're very odd and very strange and almost entirely frontal self-portraits. And she'll do weird things like put a halo around her head or gild her nipples. So they're very strange and otherworldly. She'll also distort the proportions, like the head might be too big, right? Or the body might just be too small in general. So there are weird things that happen that sort of add to the sort of surreal quality of her work, which I would call her a surrealist, but also a magic realist. Stuart Pearson Wright is a Brit. Anybody recognize the guy on the left?
Yeah.
Who is he?
He's from
Harry Potter.
Yes.
Yeah. So he is a portrait artist, and he's done some very, very well-known personas. And, obviously he's a painter. Well, he is a painter, but he does a lot of prep work with the drawings, and I think they're equally as good and equally interesting. And he, too, will play with proportion and strangeness. They're almost caricatures. I've shown you Dartmouth Kelly, I think, maybe not. And they're dramatic because they sort of emerge from the light as well. Jamie Rotley, I don't know this person very well, but I like the way he utilizes the mirror and the repetition. So it becomes a sort of window a reflecting window of infinity. Jerome Whitkin is always dramatic, through expression, through light, through caricature. I mean, he ticks all the boxes. Margaret Boland did a whole series of small African American children in this sort of like gowns and, you know, antebellum conventional symbols like cotton, you know, what do we call those, crowns, with painted faces. And obviously it's a commentary about race in America. She's American. They're very large and they're executed in black and white pastel. She also does color work and she's also a painter. Nick Lepard does a lot of self-portraits. He does primarily portraits of men, sort of in these poses of agony. And Lucian Freud is probably the most important one I'll show you in this entire lecture. He was primarily a painter, but he drew extensively, did lots and lots of prints. These are two self-portraits of his. His are dramatic because he never ever flattered anyone, ever. They are so critically sensitive to the eye and completely unfazed by the notion that our job is to flatter, that they become almost hideous. And it's the paint that transforms them in that way. Influenced by Lucian Freud is Tyshawn Scherenberg. Dramatic for the same reasons. He's obviously thinking about Lucian Freud. But Lucian Freud is actually the grandson of Sigmund Freud, and he's probably the most important painter, figurative painter of the 20th century. Hands down. So you're going to see a lot of influence in other painters from him. Here's another Tyshawn Scherenberg. Who's the guy on the right? Stephen Hawking. So he also painted a lot of well-known figures as well. And there's a detail of a Tyshawn Scherenberg. So, yeah, they're nuts and they're huge. If you see the Woody Allen film, and I've kind of boycotted Woody Allen, but he married his adopted daughter, he paints very large, and if you see a movie it's a Woody Allen movie called Match Point, they have a Tyshawn Scherenberg in it, and it is overwhelming how large they are. I mean, they're huge. He is also the host of the Portrait Artist of the Week. It's a British show that if you're interested in, you know, portrait painting, it's on YouTube. You could watch it. So your assignment, what you're going to do is you're going to create a theatrical self-portrait using light, using expression, and using an interior somehow. Light, expression, do you know what I mean by expression? Like facial expression, and an interior somehow. Those are the three things. You're going to execute it on large, good paper, 22 by 30. You will have to buy a good sheet of paper, 22 by 30. Or larger if you want to be really ambitious, but you don't really have time. You're going to do this with the aid of a photograph, and you are going to print out that photograph. Have someone else take the photos of you, please. I don't want to see arm selfies at all whatsoever. Okay? No arm selfies. It needs to be fully worked. It needs to be rich. It needs to have a full value scale and all of the standards that I typically grade you on. Questions?
What do you mean by interior?
What do I mean by interior? You need to include something other than a white wall. Okay? Yes? Yes. It can be an exterior if you want. What?
What do you mean, like an object or something in your painting?
No, you can have, like, see how you're looking at me? What's behind me? Well, I can include everything that's behind me, or I can kind of crop in so that I have this deep well, this cavernous well with this thing in the back. Right? You need to deal with space in some way, shape, or form. All right? Questions beyond that? Okay. All right. That is the end.